Um, I have another parable for us tonight. I call it the parable of the Norah fragment. Some people have heard me talk about this before. It's, as you can see, it's a stone and it's housed in a museum on the Mediterranean island, excuse me, of Sardinia. And it's considered by some people to be the oldest piece of writing in the world. And if you look at it, it even doesn't necessarily follow horizontal lines. It kind of goes off in all kinds of directions, which was part of the problem. They couldn't, for years, figure out, they brought in the best experts and they couldn't figure out at all what it said. But finally, one person, a brilliant person, solved it. And he left a note for the curator that said, "You have the stone upside down," which of course helps if you're going to interpret old writing to have it the right side up. But it seems like a good parable to me, and I'll kind of come back to it for the topics of work and leisure. Because one of the questions for us is, do we have those upside down? What is their relationship? So, of course, we've been using the Socrates line as a kind of mantra for us: an unexamined life is not worth living. And so we've been wrestling with two questions as we've examined our lives. What do you think makes for a life worth living? And tonight we're asking that in relation to work and leisure. And how do you decide on an answer? So that's our fourth week, the third topic of those three kind of central topics. And then next week, hard to believe, but the next week will be our last week. And we'll kind of do more of a summary and think about the way forward and what does that look like. So we'll just dive in. This is a fairly well known quote by Gordon Dahl. Most middle class Americans tend to worship their work, to work at their play, and to play at their worship. As a result, their meanings and values are distorted, their relationships disintegrate faster than they can keep them in repair, and their lifestyles resemble a cast of characters in search of a plot. So I took that last little line there to kind of give a title to what we're thinking about. But that first little phrase there, worshiping work and working at play, and we can kind of come back to that in our groups and think about, is that accurate or not? Lots of questions for us. This is just tip of the iceberg. What's the difference between understanding yourself as a human being versus a human doing? Can your life be defined outside of your occupation? When someone says, "So what do you do?" You know, you're on an airplane. This is pre-COVID or post-COVID imagination. So what do you do? They probably don't mean for you to say, "Well, I breathe, I walk, I eat." They probably mean for a living. So then, do you find your work meaningful? Do you feel guilty when playing? Is rest what you do after work, or work what you do when not resting? And what's the difference between recreation and rest? And of course, I think this one's a pretty important one: social location. That certainly affects the way that some people are in the world with regard to work and leisure. So we read two pieces. One of them is Mark Sluka's essay from Harper some years back, and we're just reading a brief piece of it. It's pretty long, but he stresses idleness as more than just a psychological necessity. So he would acknowledge that, but he says that it's for the good of society, that it promotes contemplation, which is one of those rare things in our busy, busy world. And he also tells that story about being at the dinner party and people bragging about sleep deprivation in the name of getting ahead. So, a couple of questions from that. What do you make of idleness accomplishing something for society? That sitting still to contemplate is a lost art. And have you been in conversations, maybe you were one of them, where people brag about their workload? You probably know that one of the new answers these days to the questions, "How's it going?" is, "Oh, really busy," which does not answer the question one bit. It doesn't say, "How's it going?" or "How are you?" It just says, "I'm busy." Sluka also points to advertising campaigns that glorify workaholism. And that he says, well, even if they portrayed leisure instead, it would just be as a reward for working hard. And then, of course, the title of the whole essay comes from the story of Sherwood Anderson's breakdown, which, it's debated whether or not he faked it. I mean, he was writing that copy ad for the paint factory. And so, how do you think of work in relation to leisure? What messages are you constantly receiving about work, either from the place where you work or just from commercial society, whatever? And what kind of messages are you getting about leisure? And what does it say that a person might have to fake a breakdown to find a different rhythm of life, a slower pace? Do you work in the paint factory? And then we read just a little bit from the Dalai Lama and Howard Cutler's book, The Art of Happiness at Work. And hopefully you picked up on this, that it kind of gets set up a little bit before that, but they mention it in the piece that we read, that there's three ways of looking at one's work. A job, which in their definition is the emphasis on making money, or a career, and the way they're defining that would be on advancement, and then a calling, having higher purpose. So they also note, and I thought this was really interesting, because you would think, well, the person with the menial job versus the social worker, that's the difference. But according to the study, the type of work didn't influence it. That wasn't what made it. So how would you describe your employment, whether it's now or in the past or perhaps even in the future, regarding these three categories? How do you view work, and what is your attitude toward the work that you do or did? And then, while seeing one's work as a calling tends to be equated with improving society, higher purpose could be defined more broadly. And they briefly mention this, like the pleasure in doing one's best or supporting one's family. That's a higher purpose. So, what do you think qualifies as a higher purpose? I like these two questions. If money were no object, would you continue to work? And if money were no object, what kind of work would you prefer? So there's some questions from what we read, but let's look at some other material that you'll hopefully make more sense in the handout as we go through. The last couple of weeks, we looked at self and others and pain and pleasure, and tonight's work and leisure. But what I'm trying to point out here is that I think it's true in all three categories that and is important. We need to think about work and leisure, but in what order? And I really think this is a key question for us. Do we work in order to have leisure, or does leisure come first? And if leisure is first, is that just so we'll be better workers? What are human beings for? Are we made to play or to work, or some combination of the two? And that's why I use the Norah Fragment parable. Is it possible we have the two upside down? So we'll start with leisure, which I guess gives away my own bias, but I think you got to start somewhere. So in his book, In Praise of Slowness, Honore notes that in 1948, the United Nations declared leisure a basic human right. We're nearly 75 years removed from that. And as he points out, it feels more like a luxury either for the privileged or a trait describing the lazy. So one of the key questions for us right up front is, what do we mean by leisure? You can't discuss the relationship of the two if you don't have a clear picture of leisure. I think we know what work means, but what do we mean by leisure? Well, it comes from the Greek, both the language and the people, the Greeks, and it comes from the word skole, and we get the word school. But, and this is a really important but, the ancient Greeks did not view school as a place of preparation for work and career, because that would be under the heading of profit earning, and it would be under this heading of work. The word skole meant a place of reflection and contemplation, and thus truth seeking. So to be in school was to not be in the rat race. To be in school was not to think about profit, was not to think about work. It was a place to pursue truth and beauty and reflection. So it was a place to be at leisure because you weren't concerned with productivity or profit. So that's a really helpful, interesting interpretation. And here's where it gets even more, I think, interesting, but a little bit controversial. So Joseph Pieper in his book Leisure, he quotes the famous line by Aristotle, which is one of the quotes that we have in the handout this week. We work in order to have leisure, which of course makes work sound primary and leisure as its reward. But he says he doesn't think that's a very good translation. He says that the Greek reads, we are unleisurely in order to have leisure. And Aristotle, of course, knows there is a Greek word for work. So he could have used that. We work in order to have leisure, but that's not what he says. The use of unleisurely instead of work there means that in a way, to be at work is to not be doing leisure. In other words, leisure, according to this interpretation, would be the primary way of being in the world, and work would be what you're doing when not at leisure. So the question then is leisure what we're doing when not working, or is work what we do when not at leisure? Aristotle advocated for this contemplation and leisure, but a contemporary of Plato's, Aristotle's teacher, Antisthenes, had advocated that work was the real virtue. So there were competing views even back then. He disdained, this guy Antisthenes, disdained festivals and music and sexual delight. He was, in our nomenclature, a workaholic. And if you read what he writes, he really holds up this notion of work. So it comes from the Americans is what I call this one. And you may have seen these kind of stats before. In the late 1700s, Ben Franklin predicted we would eventually have a 4-hour work week. During the Industrial Revolution, kind of two things happened. And this is with a broad brush, but men, women, and children were laboring 15 hours a day in factories. We know those stories. But at the same time, for others, the middle class, mostly the upper middle class, were starting to join the wealthy in more recreation. At the beginning of the 20th century, George Bernard Shaw predicted 2-hour workday by 2000. In the late 60s, a Senate subcommittee told Americans to expect a 14-hour work week. 1980s, of course, we saw predictions of technology providing more free time than ever. But in 2017, Americans chose not to take 705 million vacation days, 200 million of which could not be carried over. So we don't know about the carryover, but it raises lots of questions. In what ways has technology made life easier? Do we work less or simply have more access to work from everywhere? Is that good or bad? I don't know. Do you use all your vacation days? And why do we tend to favor work over leisure? And this one, I think, is also another kind of parable in a way. In the late 1950s, Great Britain and the United States had two teams formed of scientists, best minds they could find to unravel the puzzle of the double helix. Both teams, as you can imagine, worked really hard, but the Brits won. They won the 1962 Nobel Prize for it, and their secret was they insisted on frequent walks along the River Cam, wine tastings, reading good books, discussing British politics, attending movies, and playing tennis. And it's fascinating because the Americans, and this is still true today, American society has less vacation or holiday, as the Brits would say, and yet our productivity is not the same. And of course, you could still say, well, this is still a kind of in favor of leisure to excel at working. So again, more questions about what's the relationship. And as I've said before, this course is not grounded in any one religious perspective, but I do think the idea of Sabbath is really an important one. It's one of the so-called, and I put air quotes here, or quotes, 10 commandments, but that's not a word that's in the Bible. The Bible calls it the 10 words. And so that's where some people call it the Decalogue, the 10 words. And it's really important because if you call something a word, it's very different than if you call it a commandment. So imagine your boss calls on a Sunday evening suggesting you take Monday off, enjoy the day. Does that feel like a command or a gift? Well, sounds like a gift to me. So Sabbath itself, the word Sabbath means to cease. And it's rooted in two really big ideas. One of them is the rhythm of creation, that God would rest on the seventh day. And so that would kind of be a modeling of how we are wired. And the other one is justice for workers, remembering that the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt and forced to work incredibly hard. They should now rest a day a week, and those who worked for them should be able to rest. So, religious or not, what do you think about Sabbath rest? And you could even think about, well, how do you define what that is? Do you observe such a thing in your own life, and how so? I love this little ditty from history when the celebrated anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked what she considered the surest sign of a civilization. And her answer surprised everyone. Most guessed that it would be the development of certain tools or weapons, but she said a healed femur bone. You have to let that sink in for a moment. Here was an ancient tribe civilization that decided that someone who was hurt, if they rested, could be healed. And she thought that was really a sign of civilization. And I have the strangest association with this because I don't know if you remember when video games first came out, our kids had the Oregon Trail, which of course is very much rooted here in Missouri toward Oregon. And I remember because you have to make your way, right? And you set out across the plains and you're going along in the wagon and the little boy, he gets hurt. And I remember my son's, it said, well, if you slow down, he'll get well. And my son was like, it's too bad. We're leaving the kid behind. Uh, it really is a sign of civilization to say, I think we can stop. So, an interesting question. Why is it that the first thing we do upon waking is check the time? Good question. Barbara Brown Taylor is now retired, but when she was a professor of religion at Piedmont, she had this really cool thing she did. And I remember her telling about this. So, she got her students into a bragging contest on multitasking. She said, how many of you can do 3 things at once? And of course, all the hands went up. So she said, well, how about 4? And eventually it got to where like these 2 people were swearing that they could do 5, 6 things, 7 things at a time. And when they got through, everybody laughing and talking about it, she said, now here's a question. How many of you can do 1 thing at a time? And so she took this little box of sun-made raisins, the little snack size. She passed it around. She said, there's several boxes going around. I just want you to take one and hold it. Just hold it and look at it. I'll bet you haven't really ever looked at a raisin. So they just sat there looking at it, the veins and so forth. And then she said, now I want you to put it in your mouth, but don't bite it or chew it. Just let it sit there. Don't even suck on it. Just let it sit there and let it plumpen a little bit. So after a little bit of that, she said, now suck on it. And eventually she said, bite it in half. And eventually she said, chew it. And the amazing thing was these college students were moved by the experience. It actually was moving for them to do 1 thing and to slow down. I don't know if you've heard about this book. I think I ran across it on NPR, but the woman Annie Downs, she wrote this book about That Sounds Fun, but one of the questions, not the only question, but she asks adults, what did you most enjoy doing as a 3rd grader on a lazy Saturday afternoon And of course, the sequel question, well, what's to keep you from doing that now? And of course, Robert Louis Stevenson had, and lots of other people have had this kind of notion that all of us have a poet in us or an artist in us, a child in us, but we act as if we've died young and we wonder where the fun and the joy have gone. Okay, so that's leisure. Now we've got work to do. Notions of work are kind of, as Pieper says, kind of hard for us to grasp this. What he's getting at is this. It's hard for us to understand those ancient notions of leisure in Greek culture, right? We talked about that. But he said our ancestors, Aristotle, for instance, might have trouble perceiving of our conception of work, which I think is a given because it's 2000 plus years removed. It's a totally different society. Some people don't even think of their employment as work in the traditional sense of the word. Like, I'd be in that camp. I'm working right now. This is a ball. This is a blast. This can't be work. So how do you think of your work? Does it bring out the best in you? Does it give you purpose? How do you think of work? We've looked at some Pew Research before in 2016, so a little bit dated. A survey indicated that roughly 1/3 of Americans view their work as just a job to get them by, which is pretty sad. Roughly 50% are very satisfied with their work, and a full 15% dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. Now, the thing about the 50%, education and pay really skewed the findings. And of course, they break it all down, and I'm not bothering with all that at the moment. But the point being, of course, that some people, because they make a lot of money, would put up with a job they didn't find very satisfying, but it skewed the results. And there's also an interesting little footnote about having a friend at work and the difference that makes. Because even if you didn't like the job, you at least had this comrade to get through it with. Or if you loved it, you had someone who would enjoy it with you. So, a couple of questions. How would you rate your own job satisfaction level? And maybe the more telling question is, what are Sunday nights and Monday mornings like for you? Because a lot of people for whom work is a really struggle, a big struggle, those are, those kind of ulcer type moments. Celeste Headley is an NPR commentator, and she's written this book, Do Nothing. She says that when productivity rises, of course, companies have two options, really. You could choose to produce more, or you could choose to work fewer hours. But of course, we know that the American story is pretty much produce more. She also notes, and this is kind of the other side of the equation, that for every extra year a person works, their chance of suffering dementia decreases by 3%. A lot of interesting studies about that. So here's some questions that I find intriguing. If you only worked 4 hours a day or 6 months a year, what would you do with that extra time? Can you even imagine that? And how do you view retirement? What is it for? What is life for? And then the poet David White has this really interesting book, as most everything he does is really interesting, called The Three Marriages. So he contends that balance, the work leisure balance or work play balance, totally wrong word, because then you're forced to kind of somehow counter the upside with the downside, and of course the downside usually gets defined as work. And he says instead we should use integration, or as an integer, the whole, and he uses the metaphor of marriage. So we not only, if we choose to marry a person, marry an other, but we are married to our work and to ourselves. And he says that using that metaphor, a person can, just like in a regular marriage, a person can find oneself in that relationship or lose oneself. So in a relationship to work, that can happen. So he claims we aren't often in touch with the marriage to ourselves. We don't know ourselves well enough to recognize our gifts and interests and maybe a possible call to a certain kind of work. So a couple of questions there for us to wrestle with as well. And then he reminds us that work like marriage, again, the metaphor, will have days of drudgery, but we must rekindle the romance from time to time. And work as in love, and he has these kind of stages, right, of romance: a first glance, pursuit, engagement, living together, each of them with different stages. And of course, some marriages end in divorce. So, can you imagine rekindling your relationship with your work? Think of that using the romantic kind of analogy. How would you describe your current stage of work? Could you imagine yourself apart from it? So I think it's really fun to play with that romantic kind of imagery and apply it to work. And then a really interesting piece that I just ran across, a friend sent me: alternative views of work. So Christine Jeske is this cultural anthropologist, and she summarizes the kind of typical American approach: 4 words: work hard, life improves. And then you can see it on the chart. But she works with South African cultures, and so she's observed other patterns. And here's what she does. And you could do this yourself. You put a star representing the good life and a dot symbolizing the opposite of the good life. And then she says, using whatever you want, lines, shapes, whatever figures you want to use, try and connect them. Well, typically Americans would see no other way to do it except exactly what you see. But it's fascinating what she came up with. One South African Zulu representation looks like this. Now, notice there's no star or dot. They didn't even follow those directions, but they used a wheel, bringing people to success at times, but also bringing people down who achieved it unjustly. That's a very interesting view of work. Another man described reaching a point where success, as defined by others, that just wasn't his definition. He wanted to learn contentment. So he kind of reached this dotted line and said, I don't think it's worth it to go for the star. I'm going to learn to be happy where I am. But the most common was picturing it like this: helping each other up, or in some cases, needing to bring others down. So this one would be a fun one. What symbols or lines would you use to get from the dot to the star? How do you define success in terms of work? And our last little slide comes from Frederick Buechner. It's a kind of classic definition of vocation, which does come from the Latin for calling. He says it happens at the intersection of 2 things: the work that A, you need most to do, and B, the world needs most to have done. In other words, where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And as Buechner says it, if you only meet one of those, you haven't really found vocation. You might love doing it, but the world doesn't need it, or maybe the world needs it, but you just find it, boring or whatever. So what do you make of his distinction? How do you describe your current employment? And again, that fun little, what would it be if you could do anything for a living? So we're going to move into group time here in just a moment. You'll have the 3 questions this week: big party or small gathering, football or basketball, which I don't know that's fair to ask it in March, and pancakes or waffles. And then you'll work through the quotes and the questions that we've been looking at. But I wanted to bring back the quote from Dante. Many of you, maybe most of you, maybe all of you, were with us back in January when we hosted David Brooks and Miroslav Volf. And honestly, at the very end, we were running out of time. We were kind of going over the time that we had promised them, but we threw in that one last question: is there any one little last tidbit, practical idea you'd give us? And David says a few things about reading, and then Miroslav was the one who quoted from Dante from the Paradiso. And there's this scene where there's this ladder of blissness from lower to higher. And the Inquisitor asks the people down low on the bottom rung, so why is it you're not envious of those who are above you? And this is the answer. We only long for what we have. We've learned how to long for what we have. And as we've said every week, that's something to think about. So we'll move into groups and we'll see what we can do with work and leisure.